of the Racewalk series, and my name is Andy Drake, and I'm the manager of the Talent Hub at Leeds Beckett University, part of the British Athletics Performance Pathway, and I coach athletes, especially a group of Racewalk athletes. And our guest this afternoon, is my colleague, Dr. Brian Hanley, who is a senior lecturer in sport and exercise biomechanics here at Leeds Beckett University. And I think many of you will know, about a lot of Brian's work. So his PhD and subsequent research and the supervision of a further PhD and working with other colleagues. He's, I guess, one of the foremost experts on racewalking biomechanics. And so it's great that we've got Brian with us this afternoon. Right, I'm just going to switch over onto Brian's first slide. So we're going to talk this slide. Brian's going to talk to us this afternoon about, actually how we sort of use the knowledge of ground reaction forces. So in a number of our earlier webinars, we've been talking a lot about sort of the lower limb and being strong around the, around the ankles, and we've talked a lot about, how we make contact with the ground, and how sort of conditioning in those muscle groups is important. So we're now going to get some of the real sort of science behind that this afternoon. So, right, enough from me. Might be back for some questions later, so Brian, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Andy, and hello to everybody. So as Andy said, I'm going to talk about ground reaction forces today in this webinar. Usually we don't talk about them because they are quite complicated to understand, but I'll try to make them as easy as possible to understand. But really, understanding actual ground reaction forces is not as important as what I'll talk about at the end, which is what we found by analyzing them. In some ways, ground reaction forces are the unsung heroes of racewalk biomechanics because they show you what's happening that you can't see. So usually we would use something like video because it's quite easy to see whether the person has a straightened knee, maybe even what flight time they have, how their arms are moving. But the ground reaction forces can tell us things that we can't see. And sometimes those are the things that differentiate between better and worse racewalkers. Like Andy mentioned, I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise biomechanics at Leeds Beckett University. So I started studying there 24 years ago, and I'm still there. I did want to also mention that, like Andy said, we've done further research from what I did from my PhD and supervised future students. So some of their work will feature in this presentation, so it's only right to mention, if you see that bottom left-hand picture, the Dr. Catherine Tucker and Dr. Helen Gravestock. I'll mention some of the work I've done with them, and of course, I should of course thank all the athletes who've come from around the world to be part of the studies we've done. So with regard to ground reaction forces, like I said, they're sort of the unsung heroes of racewalk biomechanics, and they don't get analyzed, they don't get presented a lot. Like I said, they're not intuitive, they're not very easy to understand, which is why I'm going to do them today to try to show you how we use them. So before we did any analysis of racewalkers and what their forces were like, there was practically nothing published on it whatsoever. I think there was one study from 1984 that had 7 people, and if you know your history of race walking, you'll know that actually the rules changed since they changed in 1995. So the way race walkers move is slightly different from then. And in a way, if we'd brought someone in and got them to walk over our force plate, we didn't really know what was good or bad. So we didn't know what, this was a good feature or that was a bad feature, or is this person doing it properly or not properly? We didn't know. So over the last 14 years, we've collected data from more than 100 race walkers from around the world. I've got some of their logos there on the slide. We have collected data as well in competition, and by being able to marry the two, we can sort of see what's happening visually. So what can you see in terms of the way the athlete moves, and associate that or link it to what's happening with the ground reaction forces. So in terms of the research we've done, I've mentioned the force traces. We use force plates for that. We've also used high-speed video cameras, the ones that are really good for picking up little nuances of race walking. Optoelectronic systems, which are a bit more advanced, they're good for measuring rotation, especially like in the pelvis. Electromyography, which measures muscle activity. We've got an instrumented treadmill, so we've done a lot with that. And what I mean by instrumented is that it has force plates inside it, and what that means is that we can have somebody walking for long periods of time and measure changes. And it's really easy to do that with a treadmill. It's a bit harder over ground. Ultrasound, because we recently looked at tendon properties, muscle properties in elite race walkers, and something called isokinetic dynamometry, which is basically a way of isolating a joint and testing how strong the race walkers are. So what we found in the race walkers we've done on that, for example, is that they are a lot weaker than runners are, and the way the knee obviously moves in race walking has an effect on that. A lot of the results, or a lot of the findings that I'll mention today, come from that paper. It's kind of small, maybe on your screen, but by me and Dr. Nassas Bissas. We worked together on collecting these ground reaction forces that hadn't really been looked at before from Olympic and World Championship race walkers. So we got 17 top race walkers from around the world, men and women, analyze them, and the results we'll talk about today a lot of it comes from that study, because it was kind of groundbreaking in what it showed us. Now, I don't really want to give you a science lesson, because it is quite complicated and we could spend hours just talking about ground reaction forces. So I'm only going to be brief about it. Like I said, it's not really about understanding the forces. It's more about what did we find that was important from analyzing them. But just a bit of background. So what is a force? A force is an interaction that causes acceleration. So you might be familiar with the force of gravity. So you throw something up, it stops and it accelerates downwards again. Friction, another example, you kick a ball, it'll roll along the ground and slow down. So in biomechanics, though, it's important to know that acceleration means speeding up or slowing down or changing direction. So forces are not things, forces are not effects, forces are interactions. There always have to be two bodies. And what we're looking at when it comes to ground reaction forces are the interactions between the race walker and the ground. So how hard they push against it, or how hard it pushes against them when they land. Those are the kind of things we're looking at. Now, those of you who study physics or know a bit about biomechanics might know that ground reaction forces are vectors. And what a vector means is that it has a size, a magnitude, and a direction. So if you see that diagram I've got there of there are a couple of force traces, actually. They're sort of blue and pink and red. Those are ground reaction force vectors. You can see sometimes the lines are short, meaning they've got a small magnitude. Sometimes they're big, so they've got a large magnitude. And we can't see it in 3D at the moment, because that's a 2D picture, but they have a direction. So it can be upwards, downwards, side to side. But nobody who analyzes ground reaction forces would ever look at them as single vectors like that. Okay, that is how they happen, but we use maths to make it a little bit easier to understand them, which means they end up looking a bit like this. So that is a typical normal walking force trace. Instead of seeing it as those pink lines that you can't really tell the direction from, we normally break them into 3 directions. So the vertical direction just means up and down, anteroposterior, which means forwards and backwards, and medial lateral, and that'll be left or right. So if you think about when you walk along the street, you can move forwards and backwards, you can sort of move upwards and downwards, maybe up the stairs, or left and right, and they're the 3 dimensions, they're the 3 directions that we analyze forces in. I've put a little diagram of a person that's meant to be roughly in line with what's happening in the trace, but it'll be a little bit easier if I just use this next one, where I split the force trace into 6 parts. Now, don't worry if you don't follow all of this. It's not that important, but I'll try to explain a little bit. So if you see number 1, the what's happening on the force trace is meant to match up with that leg that's colored in black, so it would be the right leg. So you can see in number 1 that the foot is striking the ground. We have a little spiky bit on that blue line. I'll just talk about the blue line on the trace for the moment. Then in number 2, you can see the person's knee bends, and we get that sort of lumpy bit there in number 2, so they're sort of loading up onto their foot. In number 3, the leg is under the body, and we have a little bit of a dip. Number 4 and number 5, the black leg is starting to move behind the body, and that's why we get that blue line starting to go back upwards again, because the person is starting to push. They're pushing upwards, so the force is going upwards. And then finally, number 6, that's what we call toe off. So the toe is coming off the ground. There's no more force being applied, so that's why it drops to 0. And then that black leg will swing through and start the whole cycle again at number 1. Okay, so this is a normal walking force trace. I recognize that instantly. It has 2 peaks. If you see, it's got one big lump at the beginning in phase number 2, and it's got another one at the end in phase number 5. The first one is when you load your body at the beginning, and number 5, the one at the end, that's when you're pushing forwards again. So a normal parts of the gait cycle. In between them, in sort of 3 and 4, you have this dip, and that's quite normal because you bend your knee in normal walking, but of course you don't in race walking. If I just show you those the same graph but with some sort of annotations, you can see I've put on the left hand side of the blue line there's an impact peak. It's nothing to worry about. It's just just when you hit the ground first, there's a bit of a spike. Then you have a weight loading peak where you take the weight onto your leg. The whole weight of your body goes onto your leg. And there's a push off peak, so you're pushing forwards and upwards. There are 2 other lines, 2 other directions. So that's that blue one was the vertical one, up and down. The red one is left to right, and the green one is forwards backwards. I'll talk about those a bit later on. So like I said, that's normal walking, but we're not particularly interested in normal walking. So how does it differ from a race walking one? Well, I've put 2, sorry, I went too far. I've put 2 sort of graphs next to one another, and they're on the same scale. So you can see that on the left-hand side, I've got my normal walking force trace again, 2 peaks in that blue line with a dip in the middle. And I've got my race walking one on the right, which you can see looks a little bit different. The first thing is that it's a lot bigger. So if you see the very, very top number on the y-axis, it's 1.8. So this race walker is nearly loading up to 1.8 times their body weight. Might seem like a lot, but actually it's not really. Runners would be a lot higher than that. Whereas the one on the left, the normal walking one, only went to about 1.25. So the first thing is you load your body a lot more when you race walk. But this is not surprising because you're going a lot faster. Okay. What you might notice as well, if I split up the traces like I did on the previous slide, or one of the previous slides, is that I've numbered them 1 to 6 again. And the first thing is that the phases don't last the same amount of time. So that's one thing. In race walking, you spend more time maybe in propulsion and less time in braking and so on, but there's some slight differences. Phases number 1 and 2 are not that different, because actually there's not that much of a difference when you load your body. The real difference happens in phases 3 and 4. If you look at the race walk trace on the right hand side, you see it goes up and then it flattens off. It doesn't have this double peak like the other one does. So in phase number 5 on the left, you can see there's a lump in normal walking, but in race walking it just gradually goes down. The race walking one on the right would be what we would expect to see when we do race walking. We don't really want what's happening on the left for normal walking, because it isn't normal walking. We want what happens on the right because it's race walking. And I'll explain why this flatter pattern happens and why it's a good thing to look for, why we don't want something that looks too much like the one on the left, the normal walking one, and why we want something that looks like what's on the right, which is the race walking one. So you'll probably appreciate from coaching and competing, that normally we try to have a fairly flat path of the body's movement. And this nice diagram from Murray et al. Back in the 80s demonstrates that well. So what it's showing to you is that on the left-hand side, free speed walking, but normal walking, the center of gravity of the body will move up and down more because of the way the knee bends. In race walking, the path is much flatter. So the difference in how much the center of gravity moves up and down, and the path that you can see illustrated by the dotted lines is much flatter in race walking. Some of that is due to the way the knee is straightened, but in some ways it's also because of the way the body reacts to the knee being straightened. But when we walk normally, we don't really worry about how efficient we are, how fast we are. We're just walking. Whereas in race walking, being more efficient is important. Obviously, sticking to the rules is important. Not having too much flight time is important. So we want a pattern that's like the one shown on the right. So here's some pictures that Helen collected for her PhD, and this is something we would do often in the lab, is set up a camera to film somebody from the side, and wouldn't quite look like this. We have a program whereby we can highlight the ear in the first picture, highlight the ear in the last picture, and then see how much that person fluctuates above and below a line. So if I show you that sort of in practice, so you can see in the picture that I've drawn a line straight from the race walker's ear in the first picture to her ear in the last picture. And in the first, second, third, fourth, maybe not so much the fifth and sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth pictures, her ear is directly in line with that line. So the ear is a good part of the body to use because it doesn't move of its own accord. It's pretty rigid on your head. And that's something we look for. So we have brought in athletes before, like I've said. We click on the ear at the beginning, move the video to the end, click on the ear again, and then watch the video back in slow motion and see how much the ear goes above or below that line. And this is a really excellent idea, way of showing you that. The pictures in the middle, you can see that the athlete's ear goes slightly above the line because this is the toe-off phase. So there's probably going to be a flight phase like there are for most good walkers. But that's the idea. We want it to be flat because that's more efficient, less likely to lift and less likely to catch the eyes of the judges. So how do we achieve this? We've said we know already that the race walker's knee is straightened from initial contact until it goes under the body. And normally that would raise your body upwards, because if you think about it, normally your knee is bent, which is why you get that dip in the forced races. So what is the expert race walker doing to prevent the ear from going too much above or below that line? And this is caused by the what we call pelvic obliquity. That's dropped to the side. So most of you will be familiar, if you watch a race walker from behind or from in front, you'll see their pelvis sort of tilting up and down to each side, and that we call that pelvic obliquity. Sometimes it's called pelvic tilt, but that gets confused with another pelvic movement. So pelvic obliquity is dropping to each side. Now I know this diagram is a bit complicated to understand if you see it just straight away, but the black lines on each graph, the black line on each graph is the race walking pelvis. If you imagine you're looking at the pelvis from the front, this is the way you'd see. So you would see it moves up at the beginning, and then it drops down to the other side, and then it comes back to the middle, and then it goes up and down. The comparison on the left-hand side is with normal walking, and the comparison on the right-hand side is with running at the same speed as race walking. So we've recently tested 45 top athletes and in Helen's study, and this was what we found. So the it's this pelvic drop. That's what helps the athlete to maintain this really, really flat trajectory, really flat path of motion. Helps, like I said, to be more efficient and to avoid lifting off the ground. And it gives the race walkers their characteristic wiggle. So it's what we're kind of used to seeing when we see race walkers. You can see it's much bigger than in normal walking and in running. So unsurprisingly, race walking is neither of those two activities. It's much more exaggerated. And this is a good thing. It's not, we don't want it to be enormous. We don't want someone's hip to completely drop, but there should be some, because this is what allows the race walker to maintain this nice flat path. But it takes time to develop. It's not something that when I say develop, people starting race walking will do it, but they won't do it well. It has to be controlled. It has to be the right amount. If your pelvis drops too much, you're not going to have that flat trajectory. It's going to start dropping too much. And one of the things we noticed early on in our research was that we were finding big differences between what I ended up calling mature race walkers and undeveloped race walkers, developing race walkers. And this is a good example of this. So these are just the vertical traces. If you remember, it was the blue line on those previous ones. In walking, you get this sort of M shape. In race walking, you don't. It doesn't dip as much in the middle and then peak at the end. So I've got two athletes here. One is shown in blue, just his vertical forces, and one is shown as red, just the vertical forces again. And you can already see, I hope, there's quite a big difference between the two, sort of in that middle part. So the beginning is similar enough. They both hit the ground and the line goes straight up. And after about 0.16 seconds, you can see they both drop off the same way. So it's in the middle a bit, or the first, third, where you'll see some differences. And what you can see with the blue trace from the mature race walker, this is somebody who was around about mid-30s and had competed in several Olympic Games, is that it doesn't dip in the middle in the same way. It goes up, kind of stays flat, and then just gradually drops off. This is a really nice motion, because what it shows is that there's not much up and down movement in the middle, which is what we don't want. And the pelvis is probably working quite well. The other athlete was a lot younger, maybe half the age of the other walker, but was an elite for their age group. So a world champion in their age group. So this is not a slow race walker or a bad race walker, but it's not a mature race walking gait in the same way. So maybe this athlete needed to work more on stabilizing the pelvis, or how the knee was working. Not that they ever got disqualified, but they needed to develop it a little bit better, because it's not as efficient as that one. And this became one of our very quick guides to, is a race walker walking the way we want them to walk? Sometimes you can't see this, like I say, on video, or just watching them walk past you or judging them. So that's the first really handy thing about ground reaction forces, being able to see this mature race walking gait. Now, I say race walking gait because even though you'll have walked or run for maybe 16, 17 years before maybe you take up race walking seriously, it's not race walking. It's like, imagine if you started race walking from the age of 1 or 2, by the time you got to 16, 17, you'd have a mature race walking gait, because you've done it all the time. So a mature race walking gait takes time to develop. And like I said, at the time when we tested these athletes, there were some other ones in, there were some older athletes in who'd been in top 10 in the Olympics, and they were having this pattern. So it was quickly obvious to us that there's a certain way that over time you develop the most efficient way of race walking, and it's not always associated with how fast you're going. These guys were maybe better experts over 50 kilometers, where it's even more important to be efficient. So those are some. So that was the first thing we noticed, this sort of stuff in the vertical direction. If I go back to the graph we saw earlier, there are other directions. Now, I won't talk about the one I put down as medial there, medial lateral. It's sort of left to right. We do sometimes look at that, because what it can tell us is if there's too much of the pelvis dropping. But I won't talk about that today, because it's quite a complicated part of the graph to explain. The other part, though, is the green line. So you can see at the bottom of the graph, there's a green line that sort of dips down at the beginning and then pops up at the end. And the first part of that I've annotated as deceleration phase, and the latter part I've called the acceleration phase. And you'll always have this in walking, running, anything, race walking, there's always a deceleration phase at the beginning when your foot's in front of your body, and there's always an acceleration phase at the end when your foot's behind your body. So you have this braking acceleration continuum all the time. And what we normally want is for them to be roughly the same size. So if I just emphasize them there, normally we'd want the deceleration phase to be about the same size as the acceleration phase. This is because if the acceleration phase is a lot bigger, it means you're accelerating. Well, you want that to begin with, but you don't want to have that all the time because you'll just get too fast. And you don't want your deceleration phase to be too big because that means you're just going to slow down. So you want them to be roughly equal if you're going at the same speed, which is easier said than done sometimes. So I've just colored them in here because what we normally do with force races is we can actually do this quite quickly on the machine, but we can measure what's called impulse. And actually impulse is a better guide in this, with this direction of the force, the forward backward one, than just the force itself. Some of you might know that impulse is force by time. And at the beginning, we have negative force in the forward backward direction, so it's a backward force, and I've colored that in red. That's the braking impulse. It means you will slow down. After that, you get the acceleration impulse. So this is positive force by time. And like I said before, if you have the two of them equal, you will go at a constant speed. You don't want too much braking or too much acceleration. This is actually a force trace from an Olympic champion. In some ways, it looks more like a running trace, but you can see the same kind of thing whereby there's no big second peak. It's like it goes up to a peak about 1.8 and then just drops down again, which is, like I said, what we're looking for. So just to point out this point, because I said it looks more like a running trace, I should point out that actually it doesn't look that much like a running trace. So I don't want anyone to think that race walking is like running. If you look at these two graphs, I put them together. The person on the left is just a normal runner. The person on the right, the one I just showed you, you can see that the size when they're on the same scale is much smaller in race walking, so that you don't get anywhere near the kind of impacts. You don't get as much loading, and the braking and propulsion, they're much smaller as well. So it's not, race walking is not running, but it's not normal walking. It's something in between the two. And this is why it was so important for us to collect a lot of these force traces, because we didn't know what they were meant to look like. But now that we know, we have a good idea what's good or bad. So like I said a few slides ago, impulse is force by time. And if you want to go at a constant speed, the net impulse should be close to zero. What that means is that the braking phase, the red area, should be about equal to the area for the green one. Now there you can see in that particular graph that the red one, it lasts a bit shorter, but it has bigger magnitudes. The one on the right is more stretched out. It doesn't really matter as long as the area of the curve is the same. So if we were to measure how much of that area was red and how much was green, they'll be roughly equal. Now, one thing that we thought would be interesting to look at, which hasn't really been done before, is what I called gross impulse. What that means is that instead of measuring that braking impulse as a minus, which it really is, if we were to just make it a positive number and add that to the acceleration number, we get what I call gross impulse. Don't worry about the maths of it too much. What I wanted to see was how much the person was slowing down and speeding up. So let's imagine it's they have if you have a very small braking impulse, you only need a very small acceleration impulse to go at the same speed. If you have an enormous braking impulse, you have to do a lot of acceleration impulse to do the same speed. In other words, the less you slow down during the red phase, the less you have to speed up during the green phase to go at the same speed, to go constantly. And this is 50-kilometer race walker, so that's what they want to do. They don't want a lot of braking and speeding up like a sprinter might have. Sprinters only 10 seconds, 20 seconds. This is hours and hours. And And in this particular athlete, this value was very, very low. So he slowed down very little when he made contact with the ground in the first place, and then had to accelerate very little at the end. You might wonder why that's important. Well, the more you accelerate in the latter part, in that green sort of mountainous part there at the back, the more energy it takes up. Because if you think about it, you've got to use your muscles to push yourself forwards more. So your hip muscles, your ankle muscles especially, they have to work more. If you haven't slowed down a lot in the first place, you don't have to speed up a lot in the second place. So, like I said, this was a good example of someone who was very, very efficient. And like I said, well, he won the Olympic Games. You might notice there's a very sort of small little blip at the beginning that's green. I haven't annotated that, but that comes from heel strike. So if you think about the kind of vigorous heel strike you might get in race walkers, they have their toes pointing up and they bring the heel back quite vigorously. That's a little spike, if you like, of acceleration. So you get a little. It's not massively important, but it stops you from slowing down as much. It's not really something to concentrate on doing because it'll be kind of counterproductive, but it shows that the technique used just helps to avoid slowing down a bit, keeps you moving forwards. So it's a nice aspect of good technique. So in terms of the practical applications, like I mentioned, I haven't mentioned some of these variables during the talk. I'll try to explain them now, but these are what we found when we connected and linked the videos, so the way people look when they move, with the forces. And I'll explain these as we go along. So first of all, foot position ahead of the body at landing does not seem as important in reducing gross impulse as having a narrow stride width does. So I said that we don't want as much braking at the beginning, but actually the way to do that is not related to how far in front of your body you put your foot. So as long as you don't take that to an extreme whereby you have massive overstriding. If you do reach out way too far in front of your body on purpose, yes, of course, you will slow down more than you should. But for a normal race walker and they feel comfortable at their normal speed, there's no need to worry about how far that foot is in front. In fact, we know it should be about 21% of your height. So measure how tall you are, get about 20% of that. That's how far your foot should land in front of you. Reducing that, even though in terms of physics and biomechanics, it will reduce it, is counterproductive because you'll go slower. So don't worry about bringing the foot closer to the body when you land, because it won't make any difference. It's not important. What's more important is the second part here that I mentioned, which is a narrow stride width. And that means if you think about race walkers, often we get them to walk along a straight line. That seemed more important. So that was more important for being efficient than where your foot lands in front of you. So my recommendation there was that race walkers should have a long stride. Feel free to have a long stride that's natural for you along a straight line. So those drills actually do have a purpose to them. So just to reiterate what they're doing, they're reducing how much you brake at the beginning and reducing how much you have to accelerate again at the end. If you think about a car going around town, every time you brake, you have to stop for traffic lights or the speed bumps or something. That reduces your efficiency because you have to slow down and then speed back up again to get going again. So going 10 miles through villages and towns is a lot more energy consuming than 10 miles on a motorway where you can go the same speed all the time. So we don't want that with the race walkers. Having this narrow stride width, following a straight line on a track or something, is a good technique to help do that. Okay, the second point was that the flattered vertical trace was associated with smaller gross impulse. So once again, in terms of reducing how much we slow down and then have to speed up, the other thing that was associated with that was the flatter vertical trace that we showed nicely with the mature race walking person. So we don't want a normal walk where you sort of dip in the middle because your body's going downwards. We want the body to be nice and flat, like we had the lady race walker, nice and flat, ears following a flat line, because that also reduces it. The third point, once again, this narrower stride width, this walking along a straight line that most race walkers do to some extent. It also reduces the side-to-side movements. So I didn't talk a lot about the medial lateral forces, the ones where you're dropping to the left and right, but it helps to reduce them too. So once again, straight line, nice long stride, helps to reduce the energy costs. So very important for 50-kilometer race walkers in particular. And the last of these four sort of practical applications, which was a bit surprising for us, is that we know that in race walking you must have the knee straightened from initial contact to sorry, when it goes on the vertical upright position. What we found was that the way the body adjusts to that and so on means that you have less vertical movement. I kind of showed you that with the forced races of all the really good race walkers, whereby they don't go backwards, upwards again at the end. They stay flat and drop off. So there's no upward movement later in stance. It's not really possible because your knee is straight, and in running it'll go from being bent to being straight. In race walking, it goes from being straight to being bent. This fact means that you don't move upwards in the same way, and actually that helps you reduce loss of contact. So the straightened knee rule actually helps you to adhere to the no visible loss of contact rule as well. So good race walking technique, therefore, in terms of how the knee moves and how the pelvis balances and being on narrow stride width and so on, these will also help you to reduce your flight time. We know it's about 40 milliseconds is below the threshold for what a human eye can see. So good technique, well, in terms of your knee, won't just help you with adhering to the judges' perceptions of your knee, but also in terms of your flight times. I know I went through that, well, relatively quickly, and like I said, force races, ground reaction forces can be quite difficult to understand. And we were the first ones to really look at them in a lot of depth, so that we have got to the point now where if you show me a force race, I can recognize that that's good or that's bad or here's the problem or whatever. It takes a while to get used to. So if you didn't understand anything, feel free to ask any questions and we'll try to go through them. Otherwise, thank you for your attention. So thank you to all my helpers in work and all the athletes who volunteered and people like Andy Drake who provide us with the athletes to test on. And there will be other, Andy can talk about where we go from here.
Cool. Thanks, Brian. Super stuff. Yes, where do we go from here? Immediately, we'll take some questions. And then after this, the webinars do, they've slowed down a little bit, but they will eventually appear on Athletics Hub. And we'll be able to see them there. And if anybody struggled with any sound at their end, then someone says they can't hear me. I think it should be on here. If you struggle with the sound, then it's recorded nicely, so you should be able to go back over and have a look at any of the other sections. But we've got 20 minutes or so now, to take some questions. By all means, ask me a question, but you've put up with me on most of these webinars, so I would take the opportunity to ask Brian some questions. So, right, let's have a look. Right, Brian. So at this point, Brian, is where we saw, little names appear at the bottom. We can see people furiously typing away to ask something. But the traces for me there, they really sort of help from a practical sense. That's the sort of evidence base for practicing, having like a good foot roll, and then like leading into sort of conditioning and practicing that. So right, anyway, questions, here we go.
So any suggestions on how to evaluate these aspects while just watching your athlete? I think it's a good question, because I know that most of you will not have access to ground reaction forces. We've a lot of force plates, and this is why people haven't done them before. I think you know, the watching the head is an old-fashioned technique, I think, in race walking. You know, I've heard of people putting trays on their heads, and the athletes are trying to walk without, you know, falling off. I think just apart from, you know, the knee, which should be, you know, you should be watching it anyway, make sure that's correct, making sure there's not too much flight time. Like I said, if you look at the athlete when they're walking towards you on an athletics track, for example, where there are, you know, easily defined lines and you can see them, are they walking along that line properly? That will help what they're doing. You know, how's their pelvis moving? Does it look, you know, women tend to drop more than men. So is it dropping too much? Do you think it's dropping enough? Can you see a lot of movement in the upper body? Like I said, with the head, and we have, you know, I didn't show any, if you like, bad examples of athletes, but we have had bad examples of athletes where the head is bobbing up and down quite clearly, and that's a bad sign. So I think there are some things you can look for. If you can get even a cheap camera where you can look at it frame by frame or something like that, that can help as well. Nowadays, a lot of cameras have got a lot of phones have got cameras on them, so you can maybe use one of those. But yeah, I would definitely look at the head, the pelvis, and simple things like in coaching, are they walking along a straight line, and how's their knee going? If all those things are right, it's usually a good sign that their technique is right. Okay. Did you measure barefoot with? No. So I know I have seen pictures of race walkers who are barefoot, but you know, it's so rare for race walkers to be barefoot that this isn't something that we looked at. Now, we did look at barefoot running in Botswanan tribesmen who never ever wear shoes. They're nomads, and yeah, there's no difference for normal walking. For running, it changes where you land, but I don't think I think if you can find a shoe that works for you in terms of footwear for race walking, then stick with that. Usually the racing kind of shoes that you get from the shops for running are the best ones to go with, because they tend to have quite low heels on them. Hope that's useful for you. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that they're all equally important, but I think actually the hips are the most important. So the glutes are, the quads can be important because they straighten the knee, and they drive one of them drives the hip forward at the beginning. But I think the glutes are more, and the hamstrings are more important, because those are the ones that really drive you forward during the contact phase. The ankle muscles, they are important, but nowhere near as important as the hip ones. And usually, if you get your pelvis right, the other parts will kind of fall into place. So if you get the pelvic movement correct, so it drops the right amount, the shoulders and other parts will kind of fall into place, because they act to balance you. So they're less, I think, important to worry about. So I would say working on your glutes is the most important part of your body, because if they're not strong, if they're not functioning properly, you just won't walk. You won't walk fast, and you won't walk legally. Hope that was useful. Okay.
Cool. We have opportunity for some other questions. Thanks. Cheers. That's a good question, Dom, as well. So
I went through them quite quickly because I thought there was going to be more, but I can talk more about each of them if you want.
I'm sure there'll be some more formulating ideas. Yeah, there's a couple of people putting some questions in there.
Okay.
So,
What other studies do we have planned? So I mentioned that we started doing ultrasound and things like that because what we've done so many. Dom, you'll know we've done so many studies on with video and force plates and the treadmill and so on that it's not that we know everything, but we know a lot. So what we are interested in looking at now is like I mentioned, we started doing ultrasound because we wanted to see what the tendons were like and whether they were different or not. We started a nice little study. We tested 14 people, but then COVID-19 came along and we had to stop. So we didn't test as many people as we were hoping to. But already, like I said, it's not that race walkers are weaker than runners, but what we found is that the quad to hamstring ratio is quite poor in race walkers. Now that's probably because of the way the quads they work quite differently in race walking because you know, a lot of race walkers have very loose knee ligaments, so they can straighten their knee quite easily. And what's more important is the hamstrings. So the hamstrings are maybe a little bit stronger than not stronger than they need to be, but the ratio is a little bit different. We're also interested in what's happening with the tendons. So we already know that the way the calf muscles work is very different in race walking than in running. You don't get the elasticity. So what we're interested in is where is the elasticity? So does your patellar tendon work differently? Does the Achilles tendon work differently? Those are the kind of things we're looking at now. I'm not sure what it will do for practical applications because you can't really tell someone just to improve your tendon strength, but it might help us to understand what kind of strength training might be useful for race walkers. Yeah, so you've picked on a topic there that actually we get the students to do, which is they have to present. They can choose to present on differences between treadmill and overground gait. It's mostly running, and there are some differences. But what I can gather from the research is it depends on which treadmill you use. So if you've got a really good treadmill, like one of the really big woodways we often use in the labs, they are so powerful that you don't get much of a difference between them and overground. But if you were to use a treadmill in a gym, especially when people go right up close to the monitors so they can watch EastEnders or whatever, you do get quite a bit of a difference between the two forms of gait. The instrumented treadmill is really useful because you get multiple steps and you can set the speed. You can what's really good is that you can get rid of outliers. So if something goes wrong, you can remove those bits of data and use the rest. But as you'll know, the difference between treadmill and overground is the treadmill is moving, not you. You're staying in the same place and you're pushing against a resistance in effect. Overground is a little bit different. We haven't seen much of a difference. I mean, luckily we do. You say they're just a single step, but obviously we get them to do it lots and lots of times because just a single step can be totally misleading. So for Helen's recent study, they maybe did each speed 20 times, and you get a good picture from that. So we don't get many differences because race walkers don't. Race walkers are quite good because they do the technique so often that they have it really well drilled. You probably get more differences with running actually, where people they have a bit more variability. We've actually found a very low variability in race walkers. So I hope that answers your question. There's one for you.
Oh, for me. I thought I'd got an easy ride this evening. So hi Malcolm, that's a really good question. I think what this really tells me as a coach, or gives, we call it like evidence-based or evidence-led sort of practice. We've got the data now that for me says that we need to do a lot of work in terms of our strength and conditioning so that we can maintain a really good posture, which will then allow us to have that control the drop in the pelvis so that it's optimal, not too much, so that we don't waste energy, and then that also gives them that platform to stabilize the step with the with the glutes, pull really effectively through on the hamstrings, and then with the foot, not slap it on the floor. So the traces we saw this evening, that's of a really good athlete, and that's what we aspire to. So I think it sort of informs, perhaps what and helps sort of make sense of what you're actually seeing, just out on the track, watching the athletes, or on the road, wherever we're this morning I was out on my bike with alongside them, and so I think it sort of takes some of the guesswork out, and it's helps you be that much more objective in some of sort of the decisions that you're making. And I saw a paper, it was with runners, it's just been published, and they got a big group of runners, and there's a study been done in the UK on this. And I wondered if it was the same study, but it was actually with, I think it's from the US. Lots and lots of good runners, and they'd been in the physiology lab, and they'd measured their running economy. But then they'd ask coaches to look at the technique videos, and could the coaches detect who was the most economical? And the coaches were disastrous at it. And these were good coaches. And I did a study. I was involved in a UK-based study on the same thing. And I would, I bet I would have told you whose technique I liked the most and thought was the best technique. But marrying that up with the actual economy would be a challenge. The force plate stuff actually starts to perhaps tell us a little bit more about that. So it's taking all of this, sort of high-end stuff, lots of technicalities in the laboratory, and then using it to inform those fairly straightforward things. Being really well conditioned is a big factor. And just a final point, because there's another question for Brian. So, but I saw some video the other day of one of the athletes who is just a few years older than me, but racing at their peak. And it was a race that I was actually in the race and got it was a 10K race. And I had a good race, but I was, good sort of 40 odd seconds behind. So I did not appear in the bit of video that I saw. But I thought they were a great technician. But there was lots and lots of sort of lateral movement, and they're really sort of rocking and rolling with their technique. And I know that the athletes, particularly, they did different kind of strength and conditioning to, if they did any, it would have been different. And it's perhaps this sort of research that helps us understand that a little more. And if you took it back to some of that generation, and you go all the way back to historically for some of our great athletes, and hit them with some of the sort of the sort of the training interventions that we make today, we'd certainly make some. I'm sure it would make some changes. But, thanks, Malcolm.
Okay. Did you get the good walker to do things incorrectly to show the effect of the walker in force? Well, the Olympic champion, actually Andy was when we tested this person. The problem with him and a lot of the athletes is getting them to actually go slow enough. Athletes tear down the track when they don't realize, because it's unusual for them. So a lot of times they do things incorrectly in terms of they go way too fast. And that actually does sell us a lot, because the flight times can be absolutely enormous. But asking a race walker to do things badly in terms of, I don't know, bend your knee or move your arms properly is really, really hard to do, because actually they're so well drilled that it's very hard for them not to do it properly. It's a bit like when you're trying to get somebody who can sing really well to sing badly. It's actually hard for them to do because they're so used to it. In some ways, this is a good thing for us, because when we did the studies, people say, well, is the runway long enough? Is the treadmill suitable? Well, actually, race walkers are probably the best people to use for these things, because they're so consistent, especially the ones who've got the mature race walkings now. They don't change at all. I know what you mean about the, finding the optimum technique if we get them to do something that's not correct. I think this is a difficulty for us because, you know, we have. Is somebody race walking a certain way because they're faster, or because, what's the difference between good race walking, if you like, efficient race walking, and fast race walking? They're not the same thing. So we haven't done them, but I know what you mean. I just don't know how well we could do it. I don't know how well we could get race walkers to race walk badly, if that makes sense. Andy and I did a study on race walking drills, and without a doubt, I suppose the most important finding was, if you want to develop good race walking skill, it's just do normal race walking, and the drills. Some of them will emphasize certain things, but no single drill will get you anywhere close to race walking well, except for doing race walking well, if that makes sense. Hope that helps. I know it's not a good answer, but we've never done studies like what you've suggested. We've never done them like that. Okay. So the yeah, I mentioned the heel strike. So the heel comes down and you get that green bump at the beginning of, so you get some positive impulse when you land. This doesn't always happen in running. It sometimes happens a little bit in normal walking, but it's really much bigger in race walking. I did wonder when we saw it whether it would have an effect, and I did all the statistics on it, and actually it didn't make a difference. Now, as in that, people who had a slightly bigger one or a smaller one didn't go any faster or slower. It wasn't important like that. Having said that, we know from studies we do that if you have a group who are all world-class athletes, little things like that don't make much of a difference between them. You might find a bigger difference between if you brought in some novice athletes. So actually, maybe it does make a difference in terms of that kind of standard. But amongst the really good athletes, it didn't make much of it. It didn't make any difference, actually. There was no difference at all. But that, like I said, could be because they're all the same. It should. I don't think it really adds to acceleration, but it probably decreases your deceleration, if that makes sense. So you don't slow down as much. So if you imagine the race walker, the way they move, they swing the leg forward, the knee straightens out, that pushes the heel a little bit more forward than normal, than in running, let's say, and then that you get a little bit of swing backwards, and then by striking the ground with your leg moving backwards, I don't think you're not accelerating in the same way, but what you are doing is reducing the deceleration. And when that happens, when you get that heel strike, if you can have your gluteal muscles firing at the same time, that's when you get this really powerful drive, because it's during the first half of stance. It's from initial contact to when it goes under the body. That's the power part of race walking, and part of that, this heel strike, it's from those glutes. So it's from those hip extensors. So they are important to develop, if you like, right from when they're swinging through and starting to pull back all the way through, so that red phase is decreased. So in a way, the glutes don't move you faster, but they reduce how much you slow down, and I hope that makes sense. I don't know. Well, we know for running that that World Athletics have said you can't have a bigger than a certain amount. I would say you wanted in race walking, you want it to be quite. I don't want to say quite small, because I don't mean like in slippers or something, but you don't want the big chunky type ones, because they're more likely to scrape along the ground when you're bringing your foot through, and then they create too much of a lever sometimes when you in early stance. What I mean by that is they increase the distance sort of between where you've landed and where the center of your foot is, and what that does is cause maybe shin pain. So I think smaller heels are better. I don't know what the actual height is, but like I said, I think if you go for the racing type running shoes, they tend to have smaller heels rather than the big chunky ones that sometimes they call stability shoes. I think those ones are better.
Cool. Brilliant, Brian.
It's a good study. It would be a good study to do, Dom. Actually, we should try doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, good stuff. Thanks. Right, hey, that's taken us to 6 o'clock. That's our hour up. Brian, thanks so
Thank you.
much for making making sense of potentially some complex science, some complex biomechanics, and with some real sort of practical applications that people, the athletes and the coaches on here can take away. So. Thanks Helen for looking after the questions for us once again. From Brian and myself and Helen, then really just to say we'll be back in the next couple of weeks with our next webinar. So I'll advertise all of that on England Athletics and various other places that I'm sure you've found on social media and the like. That's us done for this evening. So take care. Thanks very much. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.